Everybody, welcome back to Capital Connection. I'm Conan Smith. I am the president and CEO of the Michigan Environmental Council. Thank you for joining us today. I am truly excited to introduce you all to our guest today, Garret Ellison. Garret is an environmental reporter with MLive. He has been covering the west side of the state and environmental issues, large and small, for many years now. And I think it is fair to say that he is probably one of the most influential writers on the environment in Michigan. His vigilance and his incredible skills as an investigative reporter have earned him numerous accolades, including Michigan Journalist of the Year. He was a recipient of that. And he has also been a recipient of the National Public Notice Journalism Award. Garret has been reporting on issues from PFAS to river contaminations to lake levels across the course of his career. And we're really excited to talk today, not just about the stories that he's been covering, but the process and value of environmental journalism to the environmental movement. Garret, welcome to Capital Connection. I'm so grateful you could make the time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this, and I'm kind of eager and a little nervous to talk about myself, I guess. It'd be weird being on the other end of it. So, but yeah, I'm happy to be here, and thanks for doing this. It's an important topic.
So I was a politician for 14 years. If you are feeling uncomfortable, feel free to shoot some questions at me, and I will give you vague, meaningless answers to them.
Right. Well, I'll keep that in mind. If I need to pivot somehow, I'll do that.
So can you tell us all a little bit about your journey into journalism and particular environmental journalism? How did you come to this space?
Sure. So, well, I got into journalism in high school, sort of the end of high school, like most people are, if you don't really know what you're doing, sometimes you fall into certain things, and I fell into photography. And that's really sort of how I got into journalism. And then, I did the local community college thing in Traverse City, NMC alum. I know there's some Traverse City folks that registered for this.
Yep.
I learned, I guess I sort of I got my first taste of like accountability journalism and the sort of the watchdog role working at the Traverse City Record Eagle as an intern and like a freelancer, and I did some obituary clerk stuff for a while and a lot of feature writing, but there was an editor there who was former editor who was a bit extreme about the accountability journalism, and he was almost he was a unique flavor for Traverse City, and you kind of learned from that a little bit, saw some of the, I guess, the righteous fury that's associated with sort of exposing sort of questionable actions among business and government, and there was an environmental bent to some of it, and so I think that had some influence. I saw the way that like decisions and the flow of events could be affected by really good watchdog journalism, so that had a big role. Didn't really get to apply that stuff too much until I was a few years into MLive. I got hired as a local business reporter back when we had 3 of those just in Grand Rapids.
Oh, okay.
And so I did a lot of general assignment, breaking news, local development, and I wrote a lot about craft beer, which is was a fun subject until it becomes the only thing you're writing about, and then you become known as the beer writer. And it's like, I didn't go to journalism school for that. So I started to beg off. And one of the editors there suggested, why not start looking at covering the environment? You really like the Great Lakes. You've done some good stuff with that. So let's make it more of a full-time thing. And that's sort of how it happened. That was about 2014. And then over time, I started to get heavily involved in sort of the Line 5 story, as that was, starting to expand in awareness. And then I had a big story on Nestle that came in 2016, and that really sort of helped propel me into these larger environmental stories. So
Do you
kinda,
remember your first major accountability piece on environmental issues?
oh boy. um, I think, I mean, when I look back, I think, the Nestle one was the one that had the impact. It was really interesting to see the way that just that one story, right? Like, hey, this big company that you've all heard of that has been controversial for its groundwater extraction in the past, they're trying to do it again, and here's the details on that. And I had some inkling of that before the one day that it really sort of hit my radar. And so with a little bit of background there, I was able to write I thought, a pretty thorough story on what was actually going down. And it just, it exploded. The interest exploded there. And then it was a clear sort of like, okay, so there's people want more information about this. Let's take a step back and take a closer look. And that coincided with the way that the state started to backpedal on a little bit on the approvals, on the approval process. And so that was really sort of, I would say, probably one of the first major environmental accountability things. But there was a lot with Line 5 early on. Looking at some of the places where that pipeline's just dented and it's it's misshapen, like they want to anchor it. Some of the places where they've wanted to put anchor supports in the pipeline the pipeline's not completely round anymore. It's oval a little bit. So I remember spending a lot of time in inspection reports, trying to decipher that stuff, trying to talk to experts around the world involved in the curvature ratio of pipelines and stuff. So that's, when I think back, those are some of the ones that come to mind.
I want to come back to this question of like this exploration that you have to do of so much data and information. One of the things I really respect is the depth that you and your colleagues who do this kind of work are able to go to, that is so helpful to building public understanding. Before we talk about the specifics of how you do your job, tell us a little bit about why. Like, you are you cover the environment as an objective journalist, but you can tell in your writing that there's a lot of passion for and concern for the Great Lakes and for Michigan and for the people of Michigan in your writing. Why is this good work for you?
Well, I grew up in the Traverse City area, the Grand Rapids area, the West Michigan area. That's sort of over the course of my life, that's sort of where my family is. And so you grew up going to the beach on Lake Michigan, and you grew up in these really beautiful, pristine, protected areas in some place. And I think that rubs off on you to a pretty big degree. Mm-hmm. A good way to sort of tell that a little bit is there was a example of the way that some of the journalism that we did around chemical contamination and per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, or the forever chemicals that I'm sure people on the call are aware of. That ended up having a unique personal connection, to me in an outcome. So there was a lot of attention that generated, obviously, by what happened, the discovery of the contamination in Rockford around the Wolverine Worldwide dump sites. And through the attention that was paid to that, and a lot of the reporting, which I think drove a lot of the attention, a lot of the efforts to subsequently start looking for that stuff everywhere in the statewide drinking water supplies. Excuse me. So they ended up finding it in parchment, right? And so that's the, one of the the sort of the big examples of, this stuff in drinking water in Michigan. I had gone, while reporting the Wolverine story in late 2017, I was going through some pretty difficult personal life issues, relationship issues, and ended up breaking up with my daughter's mother, and she subsequently moved, of all places, to Parchment.
Wow.
But it was after the contamination had been discovered.
Okay.
And so I sort of look back at that and I think, that's a really serendipitous thing, right? So, all of this effort and awareness is being paid to PFAS, and suddenly, it's blown up as a enormous concern that people are now keyed into, and then that's driving decision making and efforts at the state level to find the chemicals. And then my own daughter moves to a city where, as if those had not been found, it's very likely she would have been exposed to them.
Wow.
So it's a very sort of, I look back at that and I think, that's an interesting way that it affected me and my family personally.
Yeah, as I've read your stories, you've carried a lot of those human and resident citizen voices into the stories themselves. Like it's often difficult, particularly when you're covering a complex technical topic like PFAS, to let people understand that there's a human impact there. As you as you've written and as you've lifted up some of those voices in various articles, how do you go about balancing the human passions and then the scientific technical data that both need reporting?
Well, that's tough. I think you need to let the data sort of drive, where you start looking for the human impacts. I think that's one thing that I definitely try to do is, root the stories of the people that you talk to, and try and show exactly how that it overlays with what the data and the records are showing. So if you sort of, in the way that good policy is made as well, if you let the data drive the decisions and where you take your reporting and who you talk to, then I think your journalism is going to have a lot more impact, just in terms of, its resonance with people. If they can see clearly that the anecdotes that you are providing in the story pair pretty well, and marry with the data and the records that are in the story, then that just really makes a much, much stronger package, I think. And that's when all three of those things, or two or three of those things, when those things combine, then that journalism has some real power to drive change.
You could be teaching us all in the environmental community a really great lesson about how we do our storytelling with just that little tidbit. I think it's really easy for us to get caught up in the heart stories or the head stories and not remember the linkage between the two. And the way you do that and the way you've just talked about it is really great. And Garrett, I think you're right. Like, your storytelling has been integral to successes. You're covering PFAS in the way that you did. Like, we've gotten big wins out of that. And of course, it's not just based on the journalism. There's a lot of advocacy from the environmental community, from citizens in impacted communities, from lawmakers at all levels. But now we've got in Michigan the nation's toughest standards for PFAS. We've got attentiveness to contamination and cleanup issues that we never would have seen before. But in terms of PFAS in particular, of course, that challenge is ongoing. And just the past week, past month, we've seen a proposal from Wolverine to I'm going to forget the term that they use.
Phytoremediation.
Say that again.
Phytoremediation.
Phytoremediation. Yeah, thanks. So as they propose a cleanup methodology, can you talk a little bit about like how that comes onto your radar and what your thought process is in digging into a new thread in an old story?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting to see the Wolverine stuff is starting to percolate again in the Rockford area around the House Street dump. So that's an interesting story. I think in some ways PFAS and Wolverine's probably the largest story that I've probably ever worked on, and it's indicative of the fact that this stuff just doesn't go away. So for those of you I guess who aren't up to speed on that situation, the company Wolverine Worldwide, which is you may associate with Merrill shoes or Chaco sandals or Wolverine boots, they're based in Rockford. There's the dump where back in the 60s they put a lot of Scotchgard laden tannery waste on the ground there. And so now after a half century of that poisoning the groundwater in the area, there's been a lot of effort to stem the exposures to people who were drawing from that groundwater or that aquifer for drinking water. And now they're into this phase where they're trying to, like, how do we clean up the dump, right? What do we actually do about the source area, which is still, bleeding chemicals into the groundwater? And so the company wants to plant trees over the dump and do some small areas of impermeable capping, but basically they want to plant 4,000 trees on the dump and use the trees to sort of draw the contamination out of the ground and sequester it. And it's just not really being well received by the people who live near the dump or any of the local experts who are on a local citizen advisory board that was created by the EPA, who just sort of look at this and go, yeah, this is about real close to doing nothing. And so it's an interesting example of the evolution of a story, right? There's all the Wolverine story as a sort of a subcomponent of the larger PFAS story. There's a lot of drama. There's a lot of various sort of veins of that story, in terms of the way the contamination was originally exposed through the efforts of really dogged, tenacious, concerned citizens in the area, through the way the response went down in 2017 and 2018 and the implications and the wider ripple effects of that through, and now it's back to this very local thing again, where the people who live around that dump site are like, okay, so the drinking water is sort of taken care of for us through filters, and now we're getting some municipal water so we're not really exposed to drinking water, but we care now about, we've become activists for the larger community, and now we're worried about adequately cleaning up this dump site so it's not bleeding into the Rogue River, which gets into the Grand River, which gets into Lake Michigan, where, right there at the mouth of the Grand River is where Grand Haven draws its drinking water. Right. So it connects these people who were just a few years ago had no idea what PFAS was. They had no idea that they were exposed to it, probably had been for a long time. Now they've been kind of thrust into this role as activists and advocates for a better cleanup process, and that's really what's going on right now. There's decisions being made about how to clean up that dump.
A couple of years ago, I just joined the Michigan Environmental Council. We decided to give our Petoskey Prize for volunteer leadership to Lynn McIntosh. And I was not familiar with Lynn, and so I came on, and basically a month after I came on, you wrote a really great story about citizen sleuths and the role that they played in uncovering PFAS. Those human stories become such a part of the overall story. And I love how you just said, like, this was a local issue that got universalized because of its impacts as that water flows, but still at its heart, it's a local issue. As you are coming up with new stories, as you're delving into other issues, are you finding similar voices that resonate with you? Are there particular human stories that you've covered that are some of your favorites?
Well, the one you mentioned about Lynn McIntosh and the amount of work that she did, for years before she knew that it would ever, I guess, result in the kind of impact that it's had. That's a great story. That's, I think, one of my favorite stories. When it comes to the contamination stuff, the pollution stories, right? They can be uplifting, and then they can be very, I mean, it sort of depends on the day and the way you're thinking about it at the time. They can be very draining too, because they're people, they're stories about people who have been poisoned,
right?
Whose lives have been affected, whose families have been affected, who are just now learning why they've had thyroid cancer or all of these health issues in the past, and so that's a really difficult thing to navigate as a journalist. How to be sensitive to that sort of thing, how to tell that story in a way that isn't
exploitative, and
it isn't creating more trauma for them.
Right.
You have to think about that a lot. One of the things that I worry about, I guess, a little bit, is that we've become inured to this stuff a little bit. Especially in the pandemic, we've become numb to suffering to some degree. It's, we're in the middle of this thing that's left hundreds of thousands of people dead across the country, and feels like we've kind of barely even stopped to acknowledge that. And at the same time, it's like, what kind of impact does that have on the way we tell stories in the environmental realm? It's something that, I don't have great answers for it, other than, it's something we need to consider. I try to think about it when I'm telling someone's story. You try to be respectful of their journey. One of the things that I think, of the PFAS story and of the contamination story, there's so many different examples of the way people have been affected by pollution in Michigan. Just so many. Going back decades, you've got the PBB stuff in the 70s, you've got Flint much more recently, you've got PFAS now. And I was thinking before this call a little bit about one story that sticks with me, in my gut, in a way that I don't know how to. I want to do more with it, but I don't know how. In some ways, is the veterans up at Wurtsmith Air Force Base, who have been exposed to not just PFAS, but TCE and benzene derivatives and all kinds of really terrible stuff. I have received more emails from veterans at Wurtsmith Air Force Base over the years than any other probably single group of people who have been harmed by something.
Wow.
And they have such similar stories. I could do nothing but Wurtsmith Air Force Base veteran, contamination stories. It feels like if I And so there's just something about that one that sticks with me as like a, man, those people just really have gotten screwed over because they have difficulty linking the ailments that they have to the contamination, getting adequate health care through the VA system. There's something unique about that one and it's not just Ward Smith Air Force Base, it's veterans of military contamination at lots of different bases all over all over the globe, really. And that's a story that I really wish there was more of in the national media. I wish that story wasn't such a big lift, to get people to pay attention to it, I guess.
There's a poet.
I went off on a tangent there.
No, I love it. And it's so real. I really appreciate, like, tying it back to something you said previously, like these are the stories that make the policies important and impactful, because now we see that this is real people who are affected by it.
Yeah.
I want to segue sort of roughly and abruptly into the data side of this. We have a question from a viewer who wants to know about public data access. And in the Capitol right now, we've got bills under consideration to expand Freedom of Information Act access to the legislature and the governor's office. Michigan has been pretty decent with Open Meetings Act and sunshine laws just generally since the 70s. How much does public record keeping factor into your process, and how are you effectively accessing those public records?
So yeah, public record keeping it factors greatly into my process. Although I am, the amount of FOIAs that I file sort of ebb and flow based on the story, and it's not like a constant stream of them. So I think, any journalist is going to tell you, better transparency, more access to public records, more easily accessible public records, less fees for. I mean, I have paid, thankfully I'm a staffer for a news agency that, I'm able to expense those costs to some degree, but that sort of thing keeps the public from being able to access those records too. Anyone can file a FOIA, and there have been plenty of examples where, I've stepped in to help somebody who, was referred to me asking for tips on how to file a FOIA and not get a huge bill.
$20,000. Yeah.
Right. A state government agency that may not necessarily be trying to keep those people from getting those records through that bill. The way that the FOIA is worded, it goes through this bureaucratic process that results in a huge bill.
It's like when you Google search for like a generic term.
Right.
Like, okay, here's the 50 million responses we have to give to that.
Right. And so there's an education piece on the public side, but I think there's also, the people who process FOIAs and stuff probably need to understand that when somebody says they want all or any records, maybe they don't really mean that, and maybe you don't need to process it that way. So I do think there's efforts to understand that too. So public records, obviously it's integral to what I do and what all of my colleagues do, and not just us. I mean, I think journalists are probably actually a small percentage of the actual FOIA requests that are filed in Michigan, and probably anywhere, at the federal level too. We get a lot of attention because it's a big piece of what we do. But the bigger difficulty, the bigger lift, is getting people to go on the record. You can have a story filled with some of the best data, the most rock solid analysis, and if you don't have real people in that story who can exemplify the information that you've gotten through records or in data, it may not have the impact you're looking for because it doesn't have the story associated with it, the demonstration that affects real people. And that can be really tough. That's the piece that I don't think journalists know that. And I think advocacy groups and, to some degree understand that too. But I don't often, sometimes I wonder if the readership or the general public understands all the effort that may have gone into just getting that one person to go on the record with their name and say, yes, this has affected me. This is what happened to me. This is the uncomfortable process of sitting for the portrait, for the media, for the newspaper, being right there with the TV camera in your face. Like, people don't want that, especially if they're going through like a grieving process of having just learned about it, that they've been poisoned or their property is contaminated. And now you're the media coming in going, hey, can you tell us about this stuff? And they, I get it. People don't want to. They're like, no, thank you. And so it can be difficult to kind of explain to them that you actually can have some power in this situation if you sort of take the reins here and speak up and start to say, that you're not happy. We're not happy about this, and this is how it's affected us. Because that's the stuff that gets people's attention. That's the stuff that drives awareness, that, the data and the public records, that's a great foundation for those people's stories to rest on. And that's the tough part.
We should find better ways to celebrate and thank those people who do step up and work with you, we in the advocacy community, because those stories are so valuable to us. And I know you expose some of your life when you do that. You put yourself and your family sometimes at financial risk, and certainly the uncomfortable nature of that public scrutiny can be painful in this day and age. So yeah, we definitely need to do more to express our appreciation for that.
Absolutely.
Here, we're at our half-hour mark, but I want to ask you one last question, and this is the role that you see environmental journalism playing in the environmental movement, and where, if it were up to you, where would journalism go, and how would it fit into our process as environmental advocates moving forward?
How do those two things marry together? Well, I think environmental advocates, activists, sort of NGOs, you guys have the ability to, exist in a place that journalists can't, because we have to be neutral, and we have to be able to have it, you can sort of dissipate any kind of real impact you might have with someone who might not automatically agree with the premise of a story or the data that's being reported, if you're seen as, if it's seen as coming from a partisan or an ideological place.
Sure.
And so, I think the way that the media, environmental journalists, environmental advocacy organizations work best together is when that's recognized, and that the stuff that you guys may be providing, the input, the perspectives and whatnot, are presented in a very straightforward, upfront manner. Like, this is what we believe, and here's what we have to say, and here's where we're coming from about this, and just trying to practice the transparency that everybody kind of expects. The readers, the activists, the public, the decision makers, everybody wants there to be a more open process. And then sometimes you want that more open process up until the point where you then have to be open. And that goes for the media as well. And so I think I don't,
I think that's a great answer. Like that's a nice way to think about it. Like we, in our partnership, we have to understand your own limitations as journalists and treat you as fairly as we hope that that you treat us in that process. It sounds like.
Sure.
Garrett, thank you very much. This has been a really fun conversation, and thank you as well for the reporting that you do. It is so well crafted and so impactful on so many of the issues that we care about. We wish you good luck and continued success in that work as well.
I appreciate it, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk, and for the the help you guys provide when it's nice to be able to, it helps journalists to be able to get people on the phone very easily. And I have always appreciated the how quickly the folks like Charlotte and Tom and Sean and yourself, answer the phone when I call. So that's nice. I appreciate that.
And thanks to all of you out in the audience who stayed with us today. Really appreciate your continued attendance at Capital Connection. And a very special thanks to Steve and Judy Dobson, who sponsored this series this year, made these kinds of conversations with people like Garrett possible. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend. It's going to be warm out there. Enjoy the sunshine, and we'll talk to you all in a week or so. Take care.